Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we're joined by a very special guest, Mr. Gary Ward of Anatomy and Motion. So Gary has been a teacher of mine for several years now and helped me massively with my knowledge and understanding of movement mechanics, specifically around the foot and gait. I call him the goat of gait because he has defined what I perceive to be the best model of human walking locomotion, and I think that is something that's underappreciated in training in general. So in the episode we get into the weeds on why the foot is so important, how it relates to movement mechanics upstream of the foot, which is all of them if you're standing, and get into some really cool conversations around what might be missing in standard gym movement syllabus or syllabi, and I think that's a really important topic that's close to my heart in terms of how we can be better as a fitness industry to train the human body in the way that it wants to move, rather than these preconceived notions that we've sort of inherited rather than challenged from a first principle point of view. So stay tuned. I apologize for some slightly dodgy audio quality. We had a podcast studio booked, but unfortunately there was a big storm and it flooded, so we recorded it outside by the pool. So there's a little bit of wind, a few dogs barking, and a few creaks from the chairs that we're sitting in, but I listened to it and hopefully it's more than adequate. There's some birds chirping in the background, which gives it a meditative feel as well. But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. If you are a functional fitness professional or practitioner looking to use movement mechanics to help your own training or your clients, please check out the website to get your free 3 vital principles to movement mechanics guide. Also, Rob's strength formula. Please click the link in the description to get your 14-day free trial to Rob's strength formula program, which is your answer to the strength and muscle building equation. And also our latest sponsor, ZAAG supplements.com. If you are interested in improving your tolerance to stress, we obviously did an episode recently with Adam Thompson, the founder, talking all about how the liquid gel supplement is a much better delivery system of 29 vitamins, minerals, nootropics, and adaptogens, which can improve your mental focus and also your ability to perform in the gym, which Rob and I have both really benefited from. So if you're interested in trying it, there might be some of these left, not sure by the time this recording goes out, but we have a Lunge and Lift exclusive discount, which is Disc Lift 50, which will give you 50% off a 2-week trial pack, DISCLIFT 50. If you've missed the boat on that one, don't fret, we've got another backup option for you, which is Disc Lift 20, which will give you 20% off that 2-week trial pack as well, and there are unlimited amounts of those left. So we really recommend you give it a try, see how you feel, and hopefully you feel the benefit. Right, let's get into it. Gary.
Ashley.
Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for having me in your home in Bali.
You're very welcome. It's been lovely to see you.
Yeah.
And delighted to be your first person since COVID to be in person.
Yeah, first one in 3 years. We've actually done live, and what better setting than here? How are you finding life in Bali?
Absolutely loving it. The change has been phenomenal, much more relaxed, much more engaged. It's been a great change for the family.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and life all round. Can't complain.
Yeah, you've got an amazing setup here, so it's inspiring and envy-inducing, I think, for me and a lot of other people. So I think most people know you as the goat of Gait, I would say. And I think to give listeners who might not be so familiar with you some context, how did you learn so much about the foot and movement in the first place, and what sort of inspired your interest?
The goat of Gait is the first time I've I've heard that. Yeah, Gait is definitely something that I'm known for. Also, the feet primarily is the where the recognition is for me in my work. But I kind of like to underpin that it's not just gait. Gait is a whole body movement, and it's not just feet. It's feet are a complement to the rest of the body. But when I started my life as a personal trainer, there were very few people doing anything about feet. So that was kind of like a niche area to be focusing on. And I'd accidentally fallen into it by getting into work in the ski resorts and fitting ski boots. So there are many podcasts with many stories about my the way that I got into it. But for those who don't know, I began fitting ski boots in the year 2000, so 23 years ago, and there were 3 guys who, over a period of 3 or 4 days, taught us everything we needed to know about feet. And so that was the first time I'd seen inside a foot, i.e. looked at the bones. It was the first time I'd heard of the terms pronation and supination. You think about how prevalent that is now. And the idea with fitting a ski boot is that you get good at looking at the shape of a foot, so you can match it to the shape of a boot. And we used to say things, we'd look at the foot and we'd be looking for things like a wide forefoot, a narrow heel, a high instep, a long narrow foot, that type of thing, because the brands catered to different foot types, not all foot types. Whereas you turn up thinking you like the look of the red boot, and we'd go, sorry, but you have to have the dirty brown boot because that's your foot shape. But what we know is that when you put your foot in a boot, to get the right size boot, a right size boot is not small, it's perfect, and it's not big. But if you go for a rental boot, you put your foot in the boot and it hurts, so you ask for one bigger, and then you ask for another size bigger, and then finally you're comfortable because you can't touch the sides. Then you go skiing and the performance is terrible. So a good fitting ski boot, we knew that if you got the right length, because you look at the shape of the foot and it's pronated, that you know that the toes are going to ram into the end, they're going to feel it around the rear of the arch, and on the outside of the little toe. So you'd say to them, look, when you put this on, you're going to feel it here, here and here, and they put the boot on and they feel it there and there. So you got good looking at not just the shape of the foot, but the parts of the foot that are going to be pressing in the boot. And then we used to build orthotics to neutralise that foot, make it shorter, make it narrower, pull the dodgy bits away from the hard shell, feel comfortable. Now they're in a boot that they can actually ski in. And in that scenario, one of two things would happen, and the feedback was always in these two realms. One is, I've never skied as well as I have today. What did you do? So performance improved. And then the other side of that was, my back pain has completely gone. What was the difference? What did you do? And of course, at that time, I was like, I've not got a clue why your back pain, but my interest was piqued. So the anatomy was learnt from the ankles down, and I was keen to find out if the foot's that exciting, the rest of the body must be way more exciting. But of course it isn't. So we never got past that level of excitement. But to learn as a personal trainer was my chosen route to get a license to work with the body, and a sports therapist, and so studying injuries and studying movement. But as I've said many times before with people who are listening to this who've heard me before, is I didn't really learn much more as a personal trainer in 2000 than I'd learned reading Flex magazine growing up as a 16-year-old interested in bodybuilding. So I had that interest already. And then I was never the person who attracted the bodybuilding client, because they sit next to you and sit next to me and they go, I'm going to ask Ashley about bodybuilding, not Gary. Puny Gary in the corner. And so I ended up working with all of the people who had back pain and knee pain, and all I had was this angle that if I can make a change in their feet like I did in a ski boot, maybe I can impact on their back. So I started making connections. And there's one other ski link, which is I never forget. I tell this story and I wonder if it's as impactful to other people as the moment was to me, but I was watching a person ski down the slope. So I'm coming up a lift and I can see the angle of the slope and I'm perpendicular to it, and someone's skiing down that edge. And while I knew skiing inside out, what I noticed for the first time is that they were walking down the hill. And there was something about it that really encapsulated me, and I was like thinking about the feet and thinking about that, and when it's pronating and when it's supinating, and I wanted to suddenly make these connections. They're the Barley dogs. We can't hide that on the mic, can we?
They're gained out.
So many dogs in Barley. There was something in that moment that really made me connect to walking, movement, and I was interested in movement. I was interested in sport, and the sideline to all of that is we were skiing at a hell of an intense rate, and our bodies were being ruined. So I ended up in a place where, after 5 or 6 years of skiing, I had to roll out of bed every morning, lie on my back on the floor, stretching until I could sort myself out, and visiting this physiotherapist and that osteopath, and getting no solution. And kind of realising at the end of the day is the only person who can help me is me here, and I need to try and understand things at a higher level. So I put feet together, this idea of walking and movement as a correction, and when I say started joining the dots, I was interested so when my foot pronates, what happens at the ankle? And then when I do that at the ankle, what happens at the knee? When we do that at the knee, what happens at the hip? When that happens at the hip, what should happen at the pelvis? And all of a sudden, I can make a connection to how that foot that I've made a change in someone's ski boot is actually affecting somebody's back. Yeah. It's actually changing the permissions that the low back has. I mean, that's my word today. It wasn't necessarily my word then. But really quickly starting to recognise that the whole body is one connected specimen. And we can't deny that. Yeah. And we've grown up in a realm, and I'm talking in the 2000s, there was a lot of talk about stability, a lot of talk about controlling your core stability, and balance boards and wobble boards, but also in an area where our focus was significantly on isolation, and working one body part at a time. So back to Flex magazine, it was back and biceps and chest and triceps, and then shoulders and legs and abs. And there's nothing wrong with that until you lose the grasp or the concept that actually everything's connected. And if we can use that connectivity as a way to understand the body better, but more importantly to create solutions for people's problems, then we move into a completely different realm of what we can do with anatomy. And I think that's what I kind of did. And so I decided, I often say it was through curiosity, but as a part of this burgeoning idea, to document, if I'm going to work with somebody, I need to see where they are at what moment in time to understand how they're using their body. So it became this kind of curiosity to document the gait cycle. What is the journey that your pelvis takes in the gait cycle? The gait cycle was documented into a bunch of gait phases: heel strike, foot flat on the ground, mid stance, early heel rise, late heel rise, toe off. So I started looking at these moments and documenting, because in my head I'm already in a 3-dimensional understanding of the foot, whereas if we look at gait papers, it's a very 2-dimensional. So you're just looking at it from one angle, the sagittal plane, as we know, which is like looking at the body from the side. And so maybe it's not just an ankle flexion and a knee flexion and a hip flexion, but there's these other elements to it, and to try and work out what they are and the journey that each structure takes through those phases. So I just mentioned 5. Our model breaks down into 12 different phases in my head. We don't teach 12 phases, and that's because 5 of them on the ground are significantly different enough to each other to create completely different body shapes that explain to us the when I say a shape, so my spine will be in one position and my foot will be in another position, and it's enough for us to recognize that those 2 positions are communicating to each other at a simultaneous moment, and then microseconds later it's evolved into another shape. But there are very few shapes. So actually very few shapes in anatomy that we need to pay attention to which is great because it seems like this infinite opportunity. But there are very few shapes that we make where every single bone will be playing its part, and every single joint will be playing its part, and every single muscle therefore has to play its part.
Yeah.
When we move.
Big time. Yeah, and I think one of the things you articulate very well is how structure dictates function. So when we are trying to map out that gait cycle, we get really big clues just through the anatomy of bones. Yeah. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so one of the key factors in pulling the model together is to look at joint surfaces. Joint surfaces determine what is potential at any joint, and so a joint is often laughed at. We spend all this time talking about nothing because a joint is a space between two things. But there's bone A and there's bone B, and bone A brings a different shape to it than bone B, but it creates an articulation in 1, 2 or 3 dimensions. So we have 1-dimensional joint like the ankle, 2-dimensional joint like the knee, and then 3-dimensional joint like the hip and others. Foot joints, 3 dimensions, spinal vertebrae, 3 dimensions. And so by paying attention to that, you see the limitations of movement that are built in to the structure that we must adhere to, but not just adhere to, we must respect.
Yeah.
So we need to allow a joint to move in the way its shape determines and not prevent it from doing that. But then we mustn't try to encourage it to do things that the shape doesn't allow it to do at the same time. And so you get a really finite understanding of what every joint's capacity is. And so that ended up highlighting to me the shapes. So when I pronate my foot, flex my ankle, flex my knee, flex my hip with an internally rotating femur, and an influence on the pelvis, and that creates a shape that I call a pronating leg shape. I think this will become useful later in the podcast to highlight this now, but once those bones have moved into that shape, it creates lines of pull in muscle tissue. As those muscles are lengthened, they end up if you continued to move into that shape, the muscles would continue to lengthen and would eventually meet an end range. And the natural response from a muscle being at end range is to contract. So it turns out that the vast majority of muscles in your leg are going to be lengthened when we enter the pronating leg shape. And that, if you think about it, makes sense because we know generically we don't want the knee going inside, but we must allow it to go inside because it's designed to. And so you have more muscles set up to stop it from going inside than we do if we send it outside. And so we need to be good at going inside so that we actually stimulate these muscles and generate a contraction in these muscles. And those muscles that are controlling and allowing that movement, or as we call it, decelerating that movement as it moves into its end range, are the muscles that will straighten it.
Exactly.
So the muscles of extension. And so without a good pronation leg shape determined by the structure, the function of extension cannot happen to its best capacity. And what you find generally is a lot of people's problems come in the area of lack of extension. So your glutes don't work, hamstrings don't fire, you've got a pronated foot, can't supinate it, you need to build an orthotic to put you into a supinating position. All of the solutions to our problems exist in this extension, extensor chain supinating shape. What we're missing is the idea that if we use, as you said, structure to determine function, is let's teach the leg to access this shape, load those tissues, have those tissues contract and pull you into the equal and opposite shape.
Yeah.
So it's really important that we begin to acknowledge that all movement in a joint is from one side of its resting neutral position towards that side and then back to its resting position and beyond into the opposite position. So we have two sides of a coin on every joint. And the vast majority of people, we take a room of 50 people and get them all to assess their ability to send their pelvis left and right, forwards and backwards, rotate left and right, and you ask who's better or worse, and granted that's a binary question, but everybody will have one side that feels good and the other one that is less so. Oh, it doesn't go as far, it's not as clean, actually causes discomfort. Some people feel discomfort both ways, but a lot of the time it's one way. And I've always kind of smirked and think, when you actually ask a whole bunch of people in a room, 50% of their movements get across. Right? And that's not to say that half of their movements are not available, but they're certainly not at the level they could be. So the ability for the joint shape and surface creates the possibility for a knee, for instance, to do whatever it needs to do. We have to then be in a position to see how much of that it can do, see what it can't do, and re-educate it to be able to do what it should. And then know that when the knee does that, the thing below it should be doing this, and the thing above it should be doing that. And that, again, that leads us back into this model. So that would be happening at a particular moment in time. Yeah. So when the foot is flat on the ground, and if it doesn't happen then, it might happen in the next phase. But if it's happening in the next phase, the opposite movement should be beginning, now my timing is all out, and my influence up the chain is all out, and we end up with imbalances in the chain. So imbalances in the chain tend to be treated by, you need to strengthen this and stretch that, rather than actually pay attention to the actual usage of this of structure.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I think it's the notion that everything has a predefined way of moving that it likes, and putting it in at the right time so that the body is agreeing rather than disagreeing in each of those phases, I think is kind of what made it click for me. And I think the thing that blows a lot of people's mind about the pronating leg concept is the idea that the bad positions of a flat foot or knee valgus, the only way to get out of them is to go into them.
To go into it more.
Exactly. Yeah. So people spend their lives avoiding it, and then are surprised when they can't feel their glutes or whatever else they're
to underline that, if you look at the muscle anatomy of a back, you have the same muscles on the left as you do on the right. So if I side bend to the left and I can equally side bend to the right, I get the same amount of length in my lats or obliques on the left as I do on the right, and people can picture that. That makes sense. If the conversation is that these are guide ropes on a tent, if I pull tension on one side, the tent will lean to the right. Great. So if my lat's short on the right, I'm leaning to the right. So we want balance in that area. Yeah. So I can move to both sides. Brilliant. I have a problem when it comes to the foot, and this. Not many things have blown my mind as much as the muscles of the foot did. And I still remember sitting there, I think for 2 days, in a trance. I used a book called Gray's Anatomy, which some people think that's a TV show now, but it is also a very detailed anatomy. But it's an anatomy book that does not tell you what things do. It just tells you where they are, where they start, where they stop, insertions and origins, and you get to look at it without any bias. So I started. I now understand the structure of the foot, so I know where it's going to be, where it needs to be when the heel strikes, where it is when the foot's flat, where it is when it toes off, and start looking and laying each muscle over in 3 dimensions, going, when is the muscle short, when is it long? And long being the important one for me, because that's how we create an unconscious contraction in a tissue, is when you lengthen it. So we can talk later about gym being, a conscious contraction from a resting position. But in movement, and you can look at this on videos of cats, etc., they always lengthen muscle before they generate a contraction. So there I am, spending 3 days documenting the muscles, and the realization was that the vast majority of muscles, and I've got a list written down, I think there's 6 muscles that lengthen to decelerate supination. The rest of them, and we're talking everything from FHL, anterior tib, posterior tib, all the plantar fascia tissues, flexors on the top of the foot as well as on the base of the foot, because when the foot pronates it gets longer, therefore length has to be put into tissue. All of these muscles that come up into the calf, so soleus, gastroc, and all of the extrinsics, they all lengthen when the foot pronates. There is one big muscle called the extensor digitorum longus on the outside anterior part of your ankle that lengthens when you supinate. The rest are lengthening when you pronate. And so if we don't encourage that pronation into the foot, those supinator muscles are not given the opportunity to contract. And so we wonder why people can't supinate, because they can't pronate. And one of the reasons they can't pronate is because we spend our time in a pronated space. I know you've got questions around that. For some reason, humans spend their time in a pronated, low-arched, flatter-footed space. And the irony of that is that we don't have a lot of room to pronate into more, which is what we need in order to generate that contraction response and propel ourselves forward. So the extensor chain is shot from the get-go.
Yeah. Which is the thing that everyone cares about, because it's the force-producing part of motion.
Exactly, yeah. But if you concentrate purely on that, so if we take a muscle and we want to shorten it from a mid-range, you're not creating a need for the brain to contract that muscle. You're just doing it as a choice. But when you go walking, running, or play football, you live on the edge of your movement potential, which is why there's so many injuries. If you don't explore those end range spaces where these muscles learn to control and contract from these end range positions to protect you, then your training, which is done in this conscious place, is not able to be carried over into this unconscious place. And so the therapy work and the training work that we do in this work is all in that unconscious response. Because if you slip, or you take a tackle, or your ankle goes, and you haven't prepared it by having range potential, by being in a good position to start with, and having the muscles know how to work those positions, you're easily susceptible to injury. Yeah. So there's a big part of this unconscious movement side, lengthening tissue before it contracts, thinking about the joint's capacity that will protect you. I've long thought that even when we're walking, we're literally living on the edge.
Yeah.
You know, how many times have some ankle go just walking, or bend over and that's your back kind of gone. And that concept I talked about earlier about the fact that a joint needs to go from center to left, back to center, to right, and back to center in all three dimensions. And we find ourselves already just living towards one extreme in that range, completely unable and oblivious to the other one, and do all our movement in this little bubble rather than this much bigger bubble. And so we're living on the edge all the time. We're just waiting to break.
Yeah, I think
and we live in a broken world where when I did the shameless what's the word? Shameless kind of bit of advertising, but when I did the TV show, 6,000 emails came in, and all from people who were desperate for help, couldn't find any help anywhere, had tried everything. I feel that's the kind of realm that we live in, because one of the reasons is we live in this rehabilitation space and therapy space of conscious activation of muscle, stretching, strengthening, still got a concept and focus of balance, but missing this complete other side of the coin, which is how is my structure supposed to move? How does my structure speak to each other? Yeah. What should I be treating the painful part of my body, or the bit that's actually causing the problem? Yeah. And weirdly, the bit that's actually causing the problem is rarely the bit that's shouting loud enough to cause pain. So there's some other innocent part of the body is biting the bullet, and that's what we're treating. Exactly. And again, that's not a new concept, but for me, it's been a gift to be able to work out what that is for somebody. Treat that space, even though it's got no alarm bells to it whatsoever, but it's probably connected to some injury history piece or something like that, where we can actually create solutions for people, where they can start to pull themselves out of these holes.
That's it. Yeah, and I think that subconscious point doesn't get enough attention either, in that everything we do is so conscious and deliberate, but like you say, in life and especially in sport, what you do reactively, so when something happens, we don't have time to consciously contract any muscles. It has to be reflexive. And if that's the case, why isn't more of our training reflexive? Because that's ultimately how we want to use our body for performance anyway. And it's a big bugbear of mine in the way that a lot of training is delivered, with a massive focus on mind-muscle connection, when actually we need to let the body go somewhere and have it figure out for itself how to return safely.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, because of the bodybuilding history and fitness, it's a massive paradigm shift, which still is sticky. Like, people just can't let go of it. And this is where fitness and sport do diverge, because I think old school sports coaches just do sports drills and they're always reflexive, they're always task driven, it's never about muscle, whereas new school strength and conditioning people quite often have a lot of background in bodybuilding, and that's why they're trying to put a square peg into a round hole and get isolation stuff into performance training, which just doesn't really
and you see that at elite levels, the step away from the drills to doing stuff in the gym, and the carryover is injury. And I think somebody sent me a message at one of the top Premier League clubs. 79 games were missed through hamstring injuries, which to me is just criminal. That kind of thing shouldn't be happening. Hamstrings, there they are. Their role is to decelerate pronation, create a supination and an extension in the hip, and all you have to do is look at the structure, and these people are easily assessed, easily worked with, simple solutions, and those things shouldn't be happening, in my opinion. So that there is a carryover. That's what you're right, where we're getting a little bit lost there. I smiled a minute ago because you said the phrase "let it go" at least 3 times. Right? Famous Frozen song. But that's always been I smiled because on our courses we were just like, let it go. Because there's a significant amount of people from the industry bringing in to the classroom this need to be in control of their body, and that in itself is a painful place to live and operate. I remember a lady in a room in San Francisco stood what somebody might call beautifully, head back, shoulders back, and I remember saying, you don't have to stand like that, do you? And that was the first time. This is a grown woman. Yeah. The first time she'd been given permission to actually relax. So she relaxed, dropped her chest, let the shoulders come round, the neck come forward a little bit. And we were like, how does that feel? And she burst into tears. Wow. Such a relief. Yeah. But the indoctrinated need for control and stability, it goes against everything that the body wants to do and needs to do. When you give it the freedom to move and express itself, everything is set up absolutely perfectly, from the joint surface, as we mentioned earlier, to the shape of the muscle. You look at the lines of pronation, striation, and you can see that muscle is designed to lengthen in that direction to manage that movement of that bone, which that joint structure actually dictates. Yeah. And we just have to go with it. Exactly, Stop trying to work against the way the body naturally does, and just go with it. Yeah. Let it go with it, effortlessly, uncontrollably, liberating. Exactly. We were talking about tennis and paddle earlier, and it's something I see playing those sports with people who do a lot of gymming, in that they are very stiff, they're very tense, they can't let it go, and as a result their shots are not that fluid, and they actually can't hit the ball as hard. Like you expect big strong guys to hit the ball really hard, but actually because they're fighting themselves they can't, and then a much smaller, weaker looking guy can actually whip his forehand and boom it, and they can't make sense of it because they're like, but I'm stronger than him. So, but it's not what it's about. Letting it go, being fluid, being loose is actually how you generate real power, and you see it in all sports. Don't forget, a lot of people are strengthening to mask weaknesses, like weaknesses that they probably don't even know exist in the system. So, and we're told to do this. So if you've got a bit of a weakness in your knee, go and get on the quad machine, or strengthen your glutes. Strengthen without ever kind of going inside to the mechanics actually of why. Yeah. I always say that if you're ever told that you've got a sleepy something, or that muscle doesn't work or doesn't fire, you need to listen to that, because it doesn't fire. There's no point you going and sitting on a gym and trying to teach it to fire, because the thing that makes it fire is the joint's potential and its ability to move. So as soon as you've heard that, if anyone is listening to this and has got this area of their body that doesn't fire, you have to check out the joint mechanics.
Yeah.
And it's just, can my hip flex and extend? Can it adduct and abduct? Can it externally rotate and internally rotate? They're your basics, right? And you'll find that it can't. It will do 3 of those things well and 3 of them not. And that's you with a glute that switches off immediately. And then something else has to pick up the slack. Then you've got relationships between A and B. Well, it's not rocket science.
Exactly. Well, yeah. I think, yeah, it does sound so simple, but I think the light bulb moment is the fact that joints moving is what activates muscles. People think you activate muscles by feeling them, contracting them, doing a glute band or whatever it is, and because you can feel it, it's quite an easy trap to fall into. But what we really care about is activation in the movements that matter. So walking, running, squatting, whatever people are training for, we have to get the muscles activated in those movements, which means those joints need to move in those ways, in those movements. And I think that's the thing that people can't wrap their head around. But if you do an EMG study of glutes, like one of the best activation things you can do is just stand and clench. If you stand and clench, you can get 100% glute activation. But that doesn't really hold up when you're doing a 1 rep max snatch or squat. So
that's just that idea of needing a result, doing whatever you can to do to get a result. That made me chuckle.
So we just talked about hamstrings in football, and there's a lot of people talking about foot mechanics nowadays and the fact that there's so many different dysfunctions of the foot. Why do people say that? Is it true? And why are we in this situation where a lot of this dysfunction is increasingly prevalent?
So I don't know if I know the answer to that. And there are certain things that change your perspectives kind of as you go. So without knowing why somebody might have a flat foot generically, being able to generally work out why a particular specific person's case has ended up in their foot being flat. Some people have flat feet, and that doesn't mean that you can't do something. So I remember working with a coloured lad at Virgin Active in London, who and we were standing on a force plate, and this guy laughed because he was like, "I've got no arches, bro." Stood on this thing, and we can see he's perfectly flat, no space, no arches whatsoever. We all had a good chuckle, and he said something like, black people don't have arches, can't swim. Another good chuckle. So we did some movements in this. There was a group of them at Virgin Active, and I got him to kind of lower his body into a pronating leg, lowering a leg off a step, and which we've got videos for if people want to see this type of exercise. And then we stood him back on the force plate, and for the first time in life, there's an inkling of an arch. It wasn't an arch that everybody would go, "Wow, look at your arch," but it was there, and he could feel it. And what we'd done is put his foot into a position where he loaded those, because his foot's flat, so the muscles are as long as they get, because he can't get any longer, because his foot can't get any flatter, because the floor's in the way. But we just changed the environment enough for him to get some length into those tissues, and his brain sent a signal and said, "Right, contract." And then the contraction, of course, means what? It means the arch has to go up. And so it held that, and we put it on the test, and this guy was blown away, right? Like, obviously most people are when they experience something new like that in their body. So the point for bringing that up is that there are people with flat feet, but it doesn't mean that that's the be-all and end-all. And there are other people who've had high arches who've lost them, which is quite sad because it's happened through injury or, so then you're talking about looking at the injury. And there was a lady in... I think she was from Nigeria or Ghana, and she was classic, severely anterior tilted, butt all out the back, big lordosis. And she said, "Oh, I cannot posterior tilt my pelvis for love nor money," right? Doesn't necessarily have back pain and whatever, because that's just her shape. But she desperately wanted, listening to me, I want some posterior tilt because I've got lots of anterior tilt. The irony is she's so anterior tilted you can't anterior tilt either, right? So she just stuck. Like, stuck's not a nice place to be. And so we got some wedges, because her feet were also completely flat. Got some wedges and just propped her feet up a little bit into a more neutral position, a bit like you would with an orthotic, just to see if that would give enough permission for her to posterior tilt her pelvis. And the connection was instant. So as soon as we lifted the arch up, rotate the leg out a little bit, the hip socket changes position, and now she can do this. So her foot shape determining the limitation of the pelvis, or is it her pelvic position that's determining the limiting factors within her foot? So it becomes a very difficult question to answer, like, why are people's feet a mess? Why do we have all these foot problems?
Well, I think one of the classic explanations nowadays is shoes, the shoe spiracy, that, you know, the way that shoes have been designed over the years has actually blocked a lot of the natural foot mechanics, and we see this counter movement towards barefoot shoes that allow a lot more articulation in the bones in the foot. What do you think of that?
I hate this conversation.
Sorry.
So I don't think that shoes are to blame, and a little story around that. I also don't. I think the other story is sitting. I don't think sitting is to blame. It somehow comes down to our mechanics. So there's two things that I want to touch on there, and I didn't want to forget the other one. The first thing is that is it possible that we inflict pronation on ourselves? Because the value of pronation is so incredibly high in the body. Without pronation, we can't lengthen those tissues, and we have suboptimal extensor activation, which we need to propel ourselves forward.
Yeah.
And so what we unconsciously do is we put ourselves into places that lengthen these tissues and generate our possibility for extension. So what we actually see societally as a problem is us unconsciously creating a solution. And when I'm working with someone, I am always looking out for what a person's tactics are in their body that are setting them up to pronate better. Yeah. Because that, ultimately we need to teach that foot to pronate better, to give it an integral and authentic contraction and supination. Because the irony is, like, turning your feet out, if you've got duck feet, turn out feet, or particularly one more than the other, that is a massive signpost that your body is trying to pronate those bones so that you've got an extensor chain issue on that leg. The solution to that is not to turn your foot straight, because all that does is keeps the same anatomical leg shape, rotates your pelvis, and pushes a problem up higher into the chain. So these type of fabricated solutions are all made by going, well, it should be straight, make it straight. The irony is, if you teach somebody to pronate their turned out foot better, it will unconsciously start to turn itself back in.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that we are the way we are because of a deep unconscious desire to push ourselves forward.
Yeah.
And in that space, we are putting ourselves into compromised, pronated positions in order to move and go forward. And to counter the shoe conversation, because I always say, look, work on your mechanics. It doesn't matter what the shoe is. So buy a shoe that your foot can dominate, not a shoe that dominates your foot.
Okay.
And that's all down to your ability to have movement capacity. People go, yeah, but pointy shoes and blah, blah, blah. I love a nice pair of tailored pointy shoes that are fitted correctly, because you're, the your toes aren't in the end of that frigging shoe like they see on on Instagram pictures where they're all being squished and put together. They're longer than your foot, but they fit. You've got the ball of the foot in the right place, blah, blah, blah. So the story, it was in National Geographic, and it was the oldest footprint ever found. And it's a story, they made up a story from, as they do, from the footprint, that this was a person carrying a child on one side. They could see because of the difference in the footprint across a riverbed, and it hardened, and millennia later they found it. It was flat as fuck.
Yeah.
There were no shoes in that at that time, right? So that is not it made me laugh immediately, because I just went, well, there were no shoes then, so we can't continue to blame shoes. Maybe we blame shoes so that we can create an alternative shoe industry. Maybe shoes can be better. I hate shoe shopping, don't get me wrong. I think if you look at shoes now, the heels are too wide, they're too far out the back. They build anti-pronation, like think about everything we're talking about, into the shoe. And so shoes are, they're potentially problematic, but a good shoe that is made and designed without all of these extra little factors, if your foot can move well, I don't think the shoe is necessarily a factor.
When you say anti-pronation, could you explain that a little bit more? So why might a shoe designer do that? Is it to help somebody spring off the floor easier when they're running? Is it so they've got a stiffer foot for squatting? Why do they put anti-pronation features in?
Because pronation is evil.
Okay.
And if you go to a running store and run on the treadmill and they film you from behind, they'll spend all day with 20 clients drawing a little arrow that goes down from the middle of the back of the knee to the middle of the Achilles and then diverts out to the side going, look, you're pronating. You need an insole and you need a shoe. Sorry to be such cynical, but that's essentially how it goes. So when I wrote What the Foot, I used the phrase pronation is evil. So we build orthotics to counter it. We've got anti-pronation shoes to counter it. We have exercise to counter it that are all in the realm of supination. So at all top football clubs, all they talk about is you're strengthening your posterior tibialis. Of course, posterior tibialis is most lengthened when the foot is flattened. It's very much a three-dimensional thing. And so, and the other thing is most people don't really understand what supination is, in my opinion. So I've taught hundreds, if not thousands of people over the years, and people just don't know. We actually think, and because we've got a camera, the visual, that this is a pronation and this is a supination. So you ask a room full of people to show me with your hand what pronation is, and they'll do this. It's a bit of a trick question, but they do this and this. Nobody goes, oh, it's like this lengthening, widening, spreading and narrowing. Like, this is an arch. It should have this movement built into it. And it's not a huge movement, but it is visible and you can see it, and it does feed up and ripple through the body. So
do people need to buy barefoot shoes? No, is your answer.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
People are comfortable in them, great. If they feel like it adds value to their system, great. It's all about comfort for me. What a barefoot shoe is going to do is to change the way your foot interacts with the ground over time. And that's why a lot of people, which is the unspoken part, do suffer. So the conversation is about the transition. So how long do you take to get into it? Wait a little bit at a time, blah, blah, blah. And the brands have got pretty good at that. And I'm not anti barefoot shoes at all. I'm not really anti anything. I'm just pro making sure that your anatomy can do what it's supposed to do, so that you can live a life of comfort and joy, not have to worry about this shit. Yeah. And actually, get out on the paddle court, climb rocks, go skiing, enjoy yourself, walk to the shop if that's your Everest. All of that should be possible. We shouldn't be limited by this, but obviously there are so many limitations that there springs up so many industries, and that's what we have to deal with. But remember Vibram 5 fingers?
Yeah, I had some.
Yeah, so I put a pair of those on, and somebody kindly bought me them as a gift, so I thought I'd try them on. Within 10 minutes, because the abduction in the big toe, so the toe spreading and using the original term abduction for a toe, which is to move away from the other toes, my rear foot collapsed to the inside to compensate for that movement within minutes.
Wow.
I remember looking down going, what? The impact that had on me was significant. Now, most people don't have that level of awareness in their feet that I've had. I've been looking at feet now for 20 years, right? 23 years.
Yeah.
Jesus, that's half my life, I've just realised.
That's a lot of feet.
That's why you should listen to me. So we walked a person over a force plate barefoot. We put them in a normal shoe, their normal trainer, whatever that was, Asics, New Balance, whatever, and then walked them over in their barefoot shoe. And what we're looking for when we look on a force plate is the centre of pressure curve and the journey that takes through the foot. And then from that we can determine the foot's movement, where it's going too quickly, where it's too slow, and then it also can read upwards how that's going to impact the movements through the joint surface connections. There was no difference in the centre of pressure curves, foot, shod and barefoot shoe. So it didn't change the way that person's foot moved. It can only do what it does. Bear in mind, this was instant, so it hadn't had 3 months in the shoe, where there's probably time for it to change. But in that initial, what we saw is that it did the same thing. So it doesn't change the way the foot moves, because that line is basically determined by your anatomy.
Yeah.
And so if you want, not if you want, everybody should be waking up to the idea how simple it is to actually make a change in their system, change the way their foot moves, how that takes the pressure off the knee, gives access to their glutes, propel themselves forward, liberation in the back, even on both feet, so I'm not one-sided, I'm not hiked up into one sacroiliac joint or got one shoulder high, which gives me neck pain. Haven't said it yet, we might as well say it. Both feet, 33 joints in each foot, 66 joints, which if the left one moves differently to the right, will create different movement all the way up your left leg to the right leg, which will influence the pelvis, which then directly influences the spine, which is where the majority of our rehabilitative focuses are, where we have, it's pretty close, it's pretty similar. If you count the five sacrum and 4 coccyx joints, even though they're fused, we end up with 33 joints in the spine. So there's half of it in the spine compared to what's in the foot. Yeah. And the foot's way more complex. And so we have to focus down there to create spinal health. Yeah. Without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think to go back to what you said earlier, the body's looking for pronation and will find it wherever it can. And if there's 33 places in each foot that it can or cannot be pronating, that's a lot of opportunities to miss pronation, which need to be made up for elsewhere. And I think that helps understand why these compensation strategies arise.
Well, one of my lines is that the toes are the last line of defence. And so one of the things that if your foot doesn't pronate very well, then you're going to look up. I'm going to look up. So either I'm going to start pronating at my knee, or I'm going to look along and start pronating at my toe. So pronation at your toe is essentially a bunion. So people have got bunions and they want, let's just say that the strategy is to have surgery to straighten the toe, but you missed the whole point of the fact that what it's doing is acting as a guardian for your lack of foot pronation. Well, you teach the foot to pronate, you take the pressure off the bunion, it'll begin to straighten out, or it won't be as problematic, it'll certainly be less painful. If you take that problem and look up at the knee, now you've got a knee that is moving and grinding on all of those ligaments, because it's doing all of the work, one joint, that 33 joints below should be doing. Yeah. We have to make those connections for people. The amount of knee trouble that people have as a result of poor foot function.
Yeah. Touched on toe abduction earlier, and I know it would be remiss of me, and people will probably screaming at the podcast now, toe spaces. I'm sure you've been asked a million times, but we need to get it on the records.
Just another conversation to avoid. Do you remember I said earlier that we started talking about both sides of movement?
Yeah.
Right. So if my toes are together, I have lost the ability to move them apart. That's a problem.
Yeah.
If my toes are apart and I deny them the ability to go together,
Is it a problem?
it's the same problem,
Yeah.
right? So what happened when I put the barefoot shoe on? Because of the way that the rubber between the toes was effectively a toe spacer. So the immediate response to my foot's inability, it's not quite the right way of looking at it. So the metatarsal has moved more medial because of the spacer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when the metatarsal,
Yeah, but a lot of people will be listening, so we need... Oh, hello.
whoa,
There we go.
you're listening.
Always there. We've got
They have a foot. So I'll describe it for listeners, but I'll show it visually. But if I create toe spacers, so pushing my fingers in between the toes of the foot, what I do is I push the big toe away from the little toe. And then what I critically do is open up also, because it's not just the metatarsals that stay still and the toes get pushed out. The metatarsals are pushed wide as well. They have to. Okay, which is great because that lengthens all the tissues on the inside, the interosseous membranes and all that. But what you miss is that you start to create a closure of a joint at the back of the metatarsal, and we're creating what is effectively a supinating shape here. So that sounds positive, but we've already said that supinating is inflicting a shortening into the structure. So a shortening in the structure, contracting the tissue, deprives the tissue of the opportunity to lengthen. All of a sudden we start looking for length elsewhere in our body. Right? If your toes are all banged up and together, you put this in, creates a short-term solution, feels good, don't have the problems you had used to, but you don't know what problems it's creating in the future. That's always my conversation. When you make a change in your body, is this a whole body change or is this an isolated, localized change? There's this supinated shape. What you'll remember from doing the courses, but when your foot supinates, what shape should it make?
I don't know what you'd call that, but the arch is right, the medial transverse arch rise.
They all rise, but that makes the foot get
smaller,
and
shorter and narrower.
Narrower.
Yeah.
So now we've got a widening of my forefoot, putting a supinating shape into my foot. I'm instantly going against the grain of what the foot wants. So the one in the supinated shape, where this shape starts to happen, my foot should be getting narrower and shorter and having the contraction in the tissue. So there's a thing in movement where I discuss this idea of pressing the accelerator and the brake at the same time. If you do that in a car, where do you go?
Nowhere. Brakes wear out, yeah.
Nowhere. So if I've got my forefoot trying to create width, which is a pronation shape, and joints being forced into closure, which is a supinating shape, I've got pronation and supination happening in the same structure, which means I actually have no movement. And no movement is the biggest problem we have in society in all of our structures. So I'm known for helping people with their physical problems, changing the way we think about anatomy, and helping people have solutions for feet. And in 23 years, I've never prescribed a toe spacer, and nor have I ever recommended a shoe to anyone.
Okay.
All right. So this is why I don't. These all of a sudden this feels conflicting and confrontational, but I live and die by the sword and the joint surface. So if any of our remedies or solutions go against that natural flow of movement in our body, for me, it's the
bottom line, isn't it?
It's a rejection. Yeah.
It's the skeleton is the bottom line. If you start trying to fight it, a losing battle, because unless you've had some sort of skeletal issue, then it wants to do what it wants to do, and I like that explanation.
We're living in a losing battle. That's where we are.
I think the other common discussion in the foot world is heel strike versus forefoot or midfoot strike in running.
You're hitting me with all of them today.
Let's tick them all off.
Yeah.
So
this is good. I think people have avoided these questions on podcasts.
Really?
Before, yeah.
They're the burning questions, I think, for you. So in walking gait, movement of the calcaneus is very important.
Imperative,
Yeah. But if the calcaneus isn't touching the floor, the heel bone, then does that change the pronation? Does it change the amount of pronation? What are the implications of that on?
When we're walking, when your heel hits the ground, the immediate response, because of the shape of the base of the heel, is to roll into a pronation. The immediate response of rolling into a pronation, so we see the curve go towards the inside anterior part of the heel. That length begins, and at that point the whole foot's on the ground. So we have our tripod on the ground. Hopefully first and fifth metatarsals are grounded and useful. At that point it lengthens all of the tissue. That tissue then reaches its functional end range and contracts. That contraction returns that center of pressure in a direction of supination. And then the heel picks off the ground, and we're now focusing on these two metatarsal heads, and the articulation in the heel continues into a supination before pushing off. So initial contact, followed by pronation, followed by a supination and a takeoff.
Yep.
So when we're running, it's actually no different. So let's go with a sprinter. So a sprinter, there's no question asked. Heel's not on the ground. First and fifth metatarsals come into contact with the ground. Or a midfoot runner, the contact is at the midfoot. The immediate response from initial contact is a pronation. Mm-hmm. So you actually see the curve move backwards in space as the heel is lowering to the floor. And even though the heel's not on the ground, it's the articulation of the bones in the forefoot determines the eversion internal rotation of the rear foot. So you can't avoid it at that point. So you have your initial contact, just like walking, followed by a pronation, just like walking, followed by a loaded tissue response. Posterior tib gets its moment, and the curve turns back out towards the fifth metatarsals before cutting back in and hitting through the toe. Can draw these for you to put in the notes or whatever, but these are, you can't hide from it. So whether we're running, walking, jumping, landing, skiing, golfing, what you can't avoid is that the foot needs to pronate and supinate. Yeah. And even just saying that out loud, to hang a cap on the idea that pronation is evil and that we can just live in supination, it's a pipe dream that is utterly useless. That's not the society you want to live in, right? Yeah. But one that we're ever encouraged to do so. So heel strike running, forefoot running, midfoot running, different techniques of running. You already know what I'm going to say, right? Here's my problem: is if you get back pain when you run, and someone goes, it's because you heel strike, so you should run on your midfoot. You start running on your midfoot, and guess what? It moves. Yeah. Your back doesn't hurt. Not necessarily because it moves, but because you made a change, a positive change. But it doesn't mean that the mechanical potential in your back, hip, pelvis, or knees has changed, just that the timing has changed. The timing is important in gait as the actual permissions of movement that happen inside it. So again, we don't necessarily know the long-term impact of that change because your mechanics haven't changed. You're just using them in a different way. Feels great in the short term. What's the impact in the long term? The only way you're going to get around this is if you go, right, well, can't flex my lumbars, can't side bend it to the left, can't rotate it to the left. So the relief has come because I'm now running on my forefoot, but I still can't flex my lumbars, rotate it left, or side bend it left.
Yeah.
So that's just going to show up somewhere else in your body. So the solution is learn to flex, learn to side bend, learn to rotate, get your body into a position where it can access these body shapes, lengthen and shorten muscle tissue by virtue of joint motion first, and get into a place where your mechanics are in in an established place and then go for the run, I promise you, you won't have to think about heel striking, midfoot, forefoot. You'll run. And Helen Hall says this best. Do you know Helen?
I don't know. I know of her.
Helen Hall, she wrote a book called Even With Your Shoes On, and has a business called PFM, Perpetual Forward Motion. And if you're a runner, I urge looking her up, because there's not much she hasn't done in the running world. But the idea is that you run your way. And your way is different to my way. So we don't want to put ourselves both in a box of this particular method.
Yeah.
We just want to explore the mechanics that we have available to our body and then go and enjoy a run.
Yeah.
And again, that for me, it's mechanics first, and then you, with those in place, you have the capacity to run.
I love that idea. Because everyone's got different strengths and weaknesses, so you want to play to your strengths almost and just run with the way your body wants to move rather than forcing it to run like somebody else runs. It's a nice way to view it.
Yeah.
In terms of principles, why do we tend to shift forward in the foot when we want to run faster? Are we getting closer to those maximum lengths so that we find a stretch reflex sooner? Is that why
when we're sprinting?
When we're sprinting, or like playing sport, people say stay on your toes so you're more agile, you're quicker to respond. Is that because we're more pre-lengthened so we can then bounce off sooner?
I don't think it's that detailed, actually. I would suggest it's what I call an intangible in the body, but it's your centre of mass.
Okay.
So are you in a greater state of readiness with your weight in your heels or in your forefoot?
Okay.
Yeah. You'll have heard the phrase on the spot. You're in your heels. Get out of your heels, get on your toes, and you're ready. You're kind of. I think that act of it itself is almost energetically. There's a kind of go mode, right? Yeah. There's lots of I guess stuff out there about you miss the length shortened cycle when you're sprinting because everything's kind of already at an end range. It's going so quick, and you can see the type of work that people are doing to educate that. But this idea of your centre of mass, as I said, I call it an intangible because it's not something we can touch. We know roughly where it is. The pressure curves I was talking you through are completely related to the position of your centre of mass. So if your centre of mass is more right than left, just by the way your posture is, you'll notice that you have more weight in your right foot. So you might walk on the inside of your left foot, the outside of your right foot. You've got very different responses in your pelvis as a result of that. When you initiate walking, you actually lead with your mass. If you're going to, you unconsciously lean forward, take your step, because once your centre of mass leaves its base of support, two things will happen: you fall over or adjust to bring that mass back inside the base of support. So walking is effectively your centre of mass travelling through the base of support, which is the foot on the ground, making its way across to the other foot, which is on the ground, wiggling its way through that, and then the next one, and we're leading with that. So people who have overactive hip flexors with their mass behind, contracting their hip flexors to lift their leg forward, it's not an efficient way of walking. Teaching them to lengthen that hip flexor, to unconsciously swing a leg forward, get the mass in the right position. And I think that's the type of the stuff that you unconsciously pick up on in sport. And as a rock climber, I don't understand why we don't teach, but the kids who are good at it, we talked about this a little bit at breakfast, the kids who are good at it know how to manage their mass.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how strong you are, if you're on a foothold that is 1 centimetre squared by 1 centimetre squared and your mass is not on top of that, you're not staying on that hold, right? And so you'll watch the best climbers, how they move their body into a position to feel the balance, then it's a felt sense, but that's what's happening, is they're lining that up. Try a one-handed handstand by taking your left hand off the ground.
Yeah.
You're instantly going to fall. So one-handed handstand, which is your now base, you're going to bring that under your abdomen, wherever that is. It's the only way that you can actually do it. So there are these forces that are at play that people master and other people don't. I remember struggling just in the gym, so 2000 and 4 or 5, stood in the gym under this false impression that I can lift my leg off the ground and keep my pelvis level.
Yeah. It's crazy.
That's what I felt like I was being taught.
Yeah.
Rather than to allow my pelvis to shift and hike up a little bit and bring my mass on top of that foot.
Yeah. I see a lot talking and teaching people about pistol squats, and people are trying to stay fully stacked over that one foot and do a squat, and because of the fear of valgus, the idea that the knee could be slightly inside the foot and the hip could be outside of the foot, they're like, no, I can't go there. So they're trying to do this impossible task of staying with a square pelvis, not shifting their mass over to one side whilst balancing on one foot. And it's crazy we've got to that place.
And to respect the reason that a person's knee is going inside and the hip is going outside is because it's actually looking for the place where it experiences the load. So if you, I can't politically correctly say what I'm about to say, but when I was working in gyms, there would be ladies, 40s and above. I think you see it much, much younger these days. But then you put the foot on a bench and get them to do a lunge with a couple of dumbbells in both hands, and the knee goes all the way to the inside, and the trainer's instinct is stop it, go outside. The reason their knees go all the way inside is their brain is waiting for the contraction moment. Yeah. And when it contracts, it comes back. Well, by taking the knee away, we begin to deprive that person of that internal learning about how to contract that tissue.
Yeah.
And so it can look dangerous and it can feel dangerous, but again, if you're watching climbers on a wall, they will put themselves in the most compromised places because they are capable of going there. And when that person is capable of going there, they no longer need to go there. Because that waiting just gets shorter and shorter and shorter as the muscles learn to fire and fire and fire, and then your foot and the knee and your hip start singing together, and you actually educated or re-educated a person's movement, rather than taking those learning opportunities away by putting a knee over toe.
Yeah, exactly that. I think I've had this conversation so many times with people where they think knee valgus is a bad idea, but as we said earlier, they have to go there to learn to not go there. And so if you aesthetically don't want as much valgus, which is an aesthetic rather than a performance goal necessarily, you have to go there to learn how to control it, how to get you see it a lot in very flexible people, in that they have to go further into a range to get that stretch response. So if you're stopping them going there, you're actually blocking the activation of the muscles which control going there.
Because that is an unconscious response.
Yeah, brilliant. Great. So hopefully people have been asking about that recently can hear it again one more time. We've touched on a couple of concepts I want to link together: flat-footedness and sprinting. And there have been a lot of patterns I've observed over the years with feet as well as full body postures. And one of them is that very powerful and strong athletes tend towards flat feet. Have you seen this as well? And other patterns and possible explanations for why you think those pair together?
Do you mean like bodybuilders?
No, actually more strength athletes.
I've seen
a lot of like powerlifters and Olympic weightlifters and sprinters. You get sprinters I've seen both ways, like you get some super high arches but also some flat feet. But strength athletes, generally people who have very big deadlifts and squats, I've seen a lot of very flat feet. But I mean that's what I thought was bodybuilders going to the gym, anybody in that kind of realm tend to have turned out feet, valgus knees, flatter arches, etc. And I think what we need to do is go back to the part of the conversation that says the reason I'm turning my feet out is because I actually lack extensor chain activation, which seems crazy because the amount that they're squatting and deadlifting means surely that's all extensor chain activation. But the vast majority of it is because the most of that movement is focused in sagittal plane, not mechanics only. And
a lot of safety mechanisms are in place, such as pushing your knees out over your toes when you squat, which is probably wise if you're carrying lots and lots of poundage on your back or in your deadlift. But what you'll notice is at the bottom of a squat, it's impossible to keep those knees out. They will come in to get you that little bit of impetus for tissue to contract and help you back out again. Like, if you push your knees out and push yourself up, becomes a significant amount of effort without that unconscious response. So where are we going with this? We've got sagittal plane in a squat. You've got sagittal plane lengthening at the hips. The glutes require a lengthening through internal rotation, adduction and flexion, and because the glute response is to extend, abduct and externally rotate. So we're getting the flexion, which means we're getting length in the glute in the sagittal plane. But if we're pushing our knees out, we're creating, if you push your knees out and keep first and fifth metatarsal on the ground, you're creating a supinated foot shape with a bending ankle, bending knee, and that's going to create an external rotation in your hip and also an abduction in your hip.
Yeah.
So I'm now lengthening in one plane of glute muscle and shortening in two on my load phase as I'm going down, and so I've only got my sagittal plane to come out with, and the other thing that's lengthening is rec fem and quads at the knee end. So I've got my quads and my glutes in the sagittal plane that are able to get me back out of this position, and those things will grow, etc. But the acute mechanics that are required to load three-dimensional extensors is definitely missing, and so a perfect complementary therapy, if you like, is to spend time teaching your foot to pronate, making sure that you understand the mechanics of the knee, and then what happens is, a bit like getting your mechanics in the right way and then go for a run, is that you'll start to feel more power in your squat. I remember Chris, who was a colleague of mine, working. He was helping a show bodybuilder who had plateaued in his, I'm sure it was squat, but it could have been deadlift, but he'd plateaued anyway. And all that Chris did was improve foot mechanics and awareness of knee loading, and he blew through his PB in no time at all by shocking amounts. I can't remember the stats. But those kind of results in this guy's mind were impossible to achieve without months and months of the work. And so genuinely there's I think we're going back to that place where these flatter arches are coming out because our system, despite all the training we're doing, are craving that pronation and that extensor chain load. It's a super interesting kind of phenomenon, really. But like you say, it's pretty common. There's another thing that just popped in, actually, is this realm is also still very stability focused in a way. And so in your big power movements like this, there's not a lot of opposition taking place between rib cage and pelvis. So a lot of bracing, and those. If you can have opposition between your rib cage and your pelvis, you are able to lengthen and contract all of your corset, basically abdominal muscles, obliques, lumbar, erectors, quadratus, all that stuff, lats. They're going to get a significant amount of movement. When we keep them still, on the one hand, we train them to keep them still, and the muscles get good at not allowing movement, which then kind of carries over to the way we walk. Now, if I now walk with less and less counter rotation between my pelvis and my rib cage, the knock-on effect to that is that I will always pronate my back leg when I should be supinating it. And if anybody's listening and they want to stand up, if you stand up and put a leg behind you and internally rotate that leg, you'll feel your pelvis pushed forward. So a pelvis that doesn't rotate back means you can't supinate that foot, so it stays in a pronated place. The knock-on to that then is that when I pronate my front foot, which should happen, it should push my pelvis back towards my back foot in a rotation away from the pronating foot, but the pelvis has been pushed forward by the back foot, so that foot can't pronate. And so our pronation is completely timed out. Therefore, we're pronating late, we deprive ourselves the opportunity to supinate, and we end up in the pronated foot shape perpetually. And it's just another indicator. So we're walking forward, but we're not using the right the right extensor muscles to do that. So then they set themselves up perfectly to try and create that in their system.
Yeah,
that was probably quite tough to listen to, but
I think hopefully it makes sense. Like if you visualize, basically feet turning in to compensate for lack of movement elsewhere, and it's something we're going to get onto in terms of movement syllabus of a lot of different training styles. But I want to just go back to one point quickly, in that you said it's maybe not a bad idea to be pushing your knees out when you're lifting heavy weights, but if that blocks the loading phase in two planes of motion, is it a good idea, or are we actually blocking the extension capacity that we might have if we let the knees move medially? Then we're actually loading more tissue to help stand up the weight.
I don't want to be responsible for somebody going out there and putting 400 kilos on their back, squatting down and letting their knees come together, and the mechanics of that knee not being in place to tolerate that load. Because I know that way over 90% of people don't have the mechanics to tolerate that load.
Yeah.
They're already in that position, so you can't close a closed door. You can't open a door that's already open anymore. And so when a joint is in a valgus position, you can't go more valgus without creating stress. So you've got to come from a neutral position. So this all comes back now to education. How can we educate people to understand knee mechanics, have simple movement patterns in their own routine, even as a warm-up, to make sure that their knees are in good shape? You need to be able to pronate and supinate your foot to have that. So if you can't do that, you already know that you don't have the knee mechanics in space. Most people, and again, a significant load of people aren't aware of this, can't actually straighten their knee. And you go, can you straighten your knees? They go, yeah. But what they do is they find a blocky end range of extension, but you look at it and you go, that's still bent. And that's because they can't supinate foot. Even though they've been wearing orthotics that takes them away from pronation, even though they strengthen their posterior tibialis, it's not happening for people. So if you take that weight off, step away from the barbell, do your work, teach the feet to move, learn the patterns, integrate into the knee, integrate into the hip, pick the bar up again, load into it, you'll notice that you do it differently, more even, a more balanced pelvis, a straighter spine, you've got greater potential. A lot of people are lifting a lot of weight on very limited resources, and if you can have more access to your anatomy with the movements that you teach it to have, you have so many more resources, and your potential is, we're all operating with such limited potential compared to what we could be. Definitely. I think that's something that blows people's minds, like your friend's client, when they just have a small improvement in mechanics and their performance jumps because they're now pulling on resources that were previously it's
dormant.
Actually like a quantum leap. You miss all the necessary step changes that we think should be there. The 6 weeks of rest and recuperation before being better again, just done in an instant, because you've educated the brain in a realm to do it. So I often say, when people come complaining to me about content or being, anyone who's got a following of any kind has their haters, as they call them, but a lot of people have not seen enough magic in the realm of anatomy to actually know what's truly possible. But when the more and more you see good stuff, the more you go, wow, like, why would I not continue to push this thing, even though you're pushing against an industry that has gone so far the wrong way. It's what keeps you in. It's like that golf shot you said. When you hit the good golf shot, it just keeps you coming back.
It keeps coming back. Spot on. And I think that's it. It's just it is fighting the industry in that it's almost difficult to accept that a small change could result in a big performance jump when everything you've been told historically is progressive overload, which is absolutely true, but there are some low-hanging fruits that you can pick because most people are operating in such compromised ways. And
people are pushing so hard for the gains when actually they're just, like you say, missing the low-hanging fruit, the little things that will make those gains effortless.
I think it's a nice time to segue into
the point you were making before about the cost of training so heavily with the barbell, where we're always bracing and blocking movement through the trunk, and how that can spill over into other movements and compromise your gait, is something we've talked about a lot on the podcast in terms of what movements are we missing in general training. Like if you think about a classic gym program, which is squat, hinge, push, pull, that doesn't even scratch the surface of what the human body is capable of in terms of all the movements that it can do and how it wants to move. Obviously, we were evolved for gait, and the structure of all the bones and joints let us know that quite clearly. So in terms of designing a better movement syllabus, what are the big things that you would like to remove from most programs, and what are the big things you would add in, or what do you think would be best bang for buck additions?
Additions is easy, I think. Omissions. It's funny that doesn't really interest me, taking stuff away from people, because people enjoy, but as long as they're safe and able to do it anatomically, then probably there's some value to it. Right? Obviously, we're not teaching our feet to pronate, so that's got to be your first. It's got to be your first. We're not teaching our knees to go valgus, so that's got to follow up, and those two things happen simultaneously, so we might as well learn them together.
Yeah, love it.
Already said that we actually struggle to extend our knee. Okay, so we need to learn to extend our knee, and that couples with a supination of the foot, which is going to be this thing that starts happening because we've included pronation in our. I can't have one without the other, but I can have a lack of knowledge in how to supinate. So we might as well learn exactly how the foot supinates and include that in our movement. And ultimately, you can create a very simple, I'm going to pronate this foot and supinate this foot within 2 seconds of each other movement that will teach your knee to bend and straighten. Okay, so now we've increased range in our ankle, our knee, all of our foot bones, waking up the foot tissues, the calf tissue. Did you know that the calf is called the second heart?
No.
The calf is known as the second heart because it acts as a pump to push blood back up into the body from the appendicular areas, and if you look at the calf muscle itself goes all the way into the calcaneus, and all the extrinsics run all the way down into the toes. And so if you want a good healthy second heart that is going to pump blood around your lower body and get it back up, if you're thinking about training and blood pooling and all that kind of stuff, you need 33 joints in your feet to move well. And if you're working with people with varicose veins and stuff like that, then you'll notice that there's on that leg significant lack of movement in the structures to generate this pump, reopen the gates, etc. So we've got to start down there because it's completely ignored. Most people aren't going to the gym thinking about that, right?
Yeah.
So come higher up into the pelvis. An omission. I do want to omit something, and this is our obsession with hip internal rotation.
Okay.
So in the gait cycle, I already told you that I only follow what the body does when it does it and how it does it. Is we never ever internally rotate past neutral. Yeah. We'll only internally rotate from an externally rotated position. Yeah. And so we are in these positions, sitting on floors, forcing ourselves into hip internal rotations, kidding ourselves that all that discomfort is, we've got to work through it. Yeah. Your body despises it. It does not like it, and it most certainly does not need it. And when you go then, but in this sport, so rock climbing again is a classic, so you'll see the toe, the knee drop, and then the hip internal rotation. But that hip internal rotation always happens with the pelvis moving away from it. So if you try to internally rotate your femur and keep your pelvis still, or even worse, move your pelvis towards it to close that gap, it pinches really, really fast. There's no range there. You know that we don't need to internally rotate the hip because the piriformis is a little tiny little pissy muscle. We don't need anything with that perfect leverage to decelerate that movement. So on the inside, decelerating the external rotation is your massive adductors, psoas, iliacus. So you've got so much tissue there to manage that. So omissions is forget your hip internal rotation movements and trainings because they're not serving you.
I think just for listeners who might not be familiar with this so much, he's not saying don't ever internally rotate your hip in terms of the actual joint motion, but the position of achieving actual internal rotation. So the hip can internally rotate from an externally rotated position, as you said,
to neutral,
but only to neutral. And I think,
but it's when you're sitting on the floor in a 90-90 position, trying to lift your ankle up to force that internal rotation and kidding yourself that pain is good for you.
Yeah.
When really all you're doing is irritating the labrum and the it's a nasty, unnecessary waste of time. And if you never did it again, I promise you, it would be no downside to that for you. But you might need to learn to replace it with some other good stuff. There might be a reason you feel like you need to do it.
Yeah,
it won't be in the hip. That's going to come from lower down. So
great.
Next one, if I would go up, I'm drawn to just talking about rotation in the body, because in training wouldn't you agree there's quite a lot of rotation?
So in the gym, not very good rotation is how I think of it.
Yeah. But there is that idea. So we can get cables, we can do rotation, we can pick up a Viper and we can do rotation, we can but the problem is, as soon as you add load and speed to rotation, you're not rotating your spine anymore. So the intention is, we're talking about spinal rotation. As soon as if I would take a Viper and move that Viper quickly to my left so that I rotate my rib cage, as soon as I do that, my pelvis will be drawn to rotate with it. At which point, if my pelvis and rib cage are rotating in the same direction at the same time, my spinal rotation is zero.
Yeah.
So if they're moving at exactly the same speed, same time, the spine just stays in upright column. There's no rotation taking place at all. And the truest amount of rotation that you can get is when your pelvis is rotating in one direction and the rib cage is rotating in the other. But disappointingly, that's a really, really small range that's achieved. And it isn't something that you would be able to access if you had a load added to that movement. In order to rotate a pelvis in one direction, you're going to need a foot to supinate to make that possibility, and then a rib cage to rotate. And again, that range will be kind of costly and small, but it is so important that we actually have that. Because again, if I can't rotate my spine, I can't rotate my pelvis. We go back to that conversation where we now create a pronated leg at the back when it should be supinating and propelling us forward. Extensor chain conversation and gone again. So I think the reason I said there is a lot of rotation, there are lots of tools for rotating, wood chops to Swiss balls to Vipers, and the intention's fabulous because rotation's your powerhouse. That's where you get all your speed from and your power. But what's the point if you're not actually rotating the thing that you're intending to rotate? So you can only achieve that in a very slow, small and specific way unless you really know what you're doing there. And even then, the limitation on movement when you fully rotate your spine is so small that you don't feel like you're doing that much, but it's incredibly powerful. So I would add in the need to understand spinal rotation on a higher level.
That's a great one. And for the listeners, to help visualize it, my favorite description of this is in golf when they talk about separation, where you have the shoulders and the hips turning in opposite directions. And it's so important in ball striking sports like that. How can you give some practical tips for how people might build in an authentic rotation and separation?
The first thing to do is to stand up on your 2 feet, rotate your rib cage to the left, and observe how long is it before your pelvis is also pulled to the left. If you rotate your rib cage to the left and the pelvis goes with you, your spine is not rotating. If you rotate your rib cage to the left all the way and your pelvis is able to stay still, you're actually executing a spinal rotation. So start there, check. And then can you do that equally in both directions? Or when you rotate right now, does that pull your pelvis to the right? So your right rotation is more limited than the left, because that will show up throughout the system. Then you can hold your rib cage still and rotate your pelvis to the right and see if it pulls your rib cage. Vice versa. So you might be able to rotate your rib cage and it not pull the pelvis, but you can't rotate the pelvis without rotating the rib cage. And then your practice, as if you find it, is actually using your body to hold the pelvis still while executing a tiny little bit more rotation through the rib cage. And we can move that into a split stance. So if we stand right foot forward, left foot back, right foot forward, left foot back, and then you take your pelvis to the left. I'm just thinking about so I've gone quiet trying to think what's the best advice to give. But if you think about rotating your femur, your thigh bone outwards ever so slightly, it will pull your pelvis to the left. And then put your hands on your rib cage and take your rib cage to the right, so that you get the experience of the front left part of your pelvis travelling backwards and the front left part of your rib cage travelling forwards while staying stacked on top of yourself. And you'll begin to actually have rotation in your spine. And for a lot of people, if they do that for the first time, will feel oblique load, psoas load, glute activation on the front leg side, and this type of movement. Then you start to realise how hard it is to actually do that. And then think, if I put a dumbbell in and try and increase that speed, all it's going to do is pull my pelvis forward with it. And then because you had to rotate your thigh bone outwards, the opposite movement of the pelvis is going to pull your thigh bone inwards, and that will pronate your foot, and it's all gone. So there's thousands of rotation videos on YouTube where there's no spinal rotation taking place because they're done with speed and load. Yeah,
you see this, and I probably include myself in this, in people who go to the gym and play golf, in that it's just a whole body turn. There's very little of that separation.
Yeah, so it's all in the hips.
Exactly. You just step through it.
Yeah.
And you're missing yards.
In a movement like that, so if we go into a back swing, right-handed golfer, pelvis goes right, rib cage goes right. Because if you've got a good tripod on the right foot, pelvis will stop, and you actually have the capacity to continue the rotation in the rib cage, which means you've finally generated that muscle load to then come back and then finish the other way. So it's possible for them both to go the same way as long as you continue the movement. But as long as they're doing this together, rib cage, then you've got a spine that's not rotating. So rotating is happening very, very end range rather than throughout the movement.
Yeah.
And in Gait, it's essential that it's happening throughout.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the other thing you see. We reference this a lot. If you look at CrossFitters at the games running, they're quite often just blocks. There's no separation between shoulders and hips. Yeah. Whereas if you look at elite runners, there's loads of lovely separation because they maximise every step.
Yeah.
Great. So pronation, supination with a good knee bend, no internal rotation beyond neutral, and
at the hip,
and
spinal segments. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that's a great list. I think if everyone added that into their programs, there'd be a lot of bodies feeling a lot better, and probably performing better at the main normal stuff as well.
I should check. We have our wall cogs concept, which is this opposition, but it's opposition of pelvis, rib cage, and skull in the sagittal orientation. So anterior tilting the pelvis, posterior tilting the rib cage, and anterior tilting the skull, and we do it against a wall, so that you've got you're working with gravity, and the movement of the pelvis and the opposing movement in the rib cage creates an extension and a flexion in the neck and we call them cogs because they articulating like mechanical cogs in the clock. And then the opposition movement to that, which is to posterior tilt, anterior tilt rib cage, and then you're getting flexion and extension through the whole spine. It's pretty much something to do with every person that I ever work with. It's not even like if we're forward head, if we've got a pelvis limitation stuck in anterior tilt or a flat part of our spine, we've got to be able to teach our spine to articulate those 33 joints at all levels. So most people are extending through their lumbars, low back pain, and flexing through their thoracics. And they can't extend through the thoracics and they can't flex their lumbars. And this is something where we can teach people quite easily how to access those areas of their spine that they're missing. So that's sagittal plane spine and rotational plane spine, I guess we've brought up. But most people are doing cat-cow scenario, so on all fours, and then push up to the ceiling, and you're all pushing through here, which is I've got my finger on my sternum, so I'm flexing through those thoracics, and then when you come back down again, you pull through your belly button and feel the low lumbars kind of extending, often the trick is just to switch that, just teach people to extend through the thoracic, flex back up through the lumbars, look for the pieces that aren't moving and working together. And the other thing is with wall cogs versus that we're used to is when we do. I never know which one's which, cat or cow, but if I do the flexion one, I tuck my chin into my chest so that we're intending to flex the whole spine and then extend the whole spine. But of course, when you're walking, eyes on the horizon, head stays level. As I'm extending through my spine, my neck is flexing, so it's creating opposition, the opposite, and that's a beautiful movement to kind of experience. And it's something that's missing when we kind of do that floor-based access to it. So we use our unconscious movement habits to generate the movements that we think are good for us. We need somebody to point out which parts of our spine we're not using to teach us to do that, so we can become unconscious so that we can do it well. And then we want to change some of the movement cues so that we're doing something that is relevant to us moving about the planet, which is normally keeping the eyes on the horizon, center of mass over both feet, and an awareness to travel between left and right.
Brilliant. And there's so much good stuff baked into those cogs in that we've identified that there are missing joint motions, and rather than just bringing the specifically missing ones back, we're also integrating them into their neighbouring joints, so treating the spine as a whole rather than just an individual area that's perhaps not moving, and then also integrating it with walking gait mechanics, which is ultimately what we want those joints moving for. And I think the traditional view of mobility doesn't pay enough credence to the body as a system and also the end result of how we want to move and why we want to move the body. And it just blends those concepts really beautifully, I think.
The way you started that made me also think that something I think just naturally going to get missed in that conversation. So we talk about the cog, the pelvis tilting and the ribcage lifting. We have to then mention all of that abdominal tissue that's now lengthening. When we reverse that, all of that abdominal tissue is now contracting. So that's rectus, obliques. When you reverse that and go into a full range on the other side, you're putting length into your spinal erectors, your lats, your QL. And then you come back out the other side. It's not just the abs, you've got your serratus, your pecs, lengthening while the rhomboids and traps are shortening at the bottom, lengthening at the top because the head is going. You all of a sudden, this really simple movement is activating every muscle above the waist without even thinking about it. I mean, one of the hardest things I find for people to do is flex their lumbars. It is such a difficult movement for people to achieve. And the irony is, because with an industry that's, get your abs, and the abdominals do what, if you read the anatomy book, flex the spine, and people can't flex the spine, and they're chasing this kind of pipe dream of abdominals. It's super interesting limitation. So actually to go up there, and it led me onto this final addition, but this is actually more to have a bit of fun. If you, when you're doing that, you recognize scapulars lower as you extend and rise as you flex. And your humerus, when you flex, internally rotates as the scapula rises up and out, and then the humerus externally rotates. So you can begin this cog by standing and just rotating your thumbs externally outwards. So the elbow pockets move outwards on both sides, humerus is rotated, shoulders begin to lift back, drop down, scaps down, ribcage lift, roll into an anterior tilt in the pelvis, feel the weight move into the anterior parts of your forefeet, and then reverse it so that you get the flexion. Now your ribcage drops, your head, chin pops up a little bit, the arms are going internal, the elbow pockets internal, the thumbs internal, flexion through your whole spine, posterior tilt in the pelvis, weight in your heels.
Yeah.
And then to feel this trippy, like, forefoot to rear foot to forefoot to rear foot to tilt to in to out with the arms. And then for someone like yourself who's experienced in that movement, pick up some dumbbells and start using the momentum of the dumbbells in this position and have that. And you, when you put that down, you feel like you've had a hell of a workout, because all of those muscles from head to toe have just been engaged super quickly. Really fun.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And to go back to what we said earlier about subconscious activation, you're letting yourself go into those positions. So using the dumbbells and staying relaxed, I think, is, again, quite counterculture in the gym, where it's all about effort and trying and doing it right, but you have to let the body learn itself. And I think,
well, there's lots of, like, just internally rotate your arm, but keep this still.
Yeah.
Fix the scapula, move the arm. No.
Yeah.
When you move the arm, the scapula has to move. And as that's going to move, it's going to create a flexion. If I'm doing it one-handed, it's going to create a rotation. That rotation should create a counter rotation. I'm walking all of a sudden.
Yeah.
So be in flow with it. Be mindful about it. Don't be controlling. So if you're going to move your arms like we just described, let your body follow.
Yeah.
Let it express itself. Feel it. There's not a person on the planet if they really let go, doesn't have these responses in the rest of the body, because the joint surfaces dictate and determine that that's exactly what should happen and does.
Yeah, beautiful. I think that's a great place to finish. Thank you so much, Gary. That was hugely interesting and informative, and I bet the listeners have got a ton out of it.
I hope so. I hope they've got a lot out of it. I've absolutely loved sitting by the pool.
Yeah, I know.
Having a good yarn.
This.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll have to do a part 2 sometime.
Well, you'll have to fly back over.
Yeah. Don't worry about that. It's all right. Thanks, Gary.
Cheers, Ashley.
I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did, and took away plenty of food for thought for how we can move better, either in our own training or in our clients' training, how we can adapt movements or pick movements that work with how the body wants to move rather than against it. And I think everybody would start to feel better if we took that approach more often. If you would like to learn more about Gary and his methodology, please visit his website, findingcentre.co.uk, or check him out on Instagram at Gary Ward AIM. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of his approach and the way that he does things, and it's definitely influenced my practice a lot. And before we go, as always, if you've got this far, thank you for listening this far. If you think somebody else would benefit from hearing this episode, please do share it with them directly or on your stories, and tag us at lunge.lift. We really appreciate every time you do. And the more the podcast grows, the more easily we can attract great guests like Gary. So even if you don't care about our success, do it for selfish reasons, and we'll be able to get you bigger and better guests each week. Before we go, big thank you to our show sponsors, wit-fitness.com. Use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off your Wit kit. And also Hytro, use our discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you next week.